What broke up the Beatles? John Lennon, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, and Paul McCartney were a phenomenon. Young, funny, handsome, if you like protective hairdos, and genuinely talented. Sure, when they hit the stage of The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964, you could argue that they were just a fad, but 6 years, 20 #1 hits, and an endless spree of psychedelics later, these guys were an undeniable marvel. But behind the scenes, none of that could have happened without the work of one man, the fifth Beatle, Brian Epstein. He was older, posh, and put together. The businessman offered the already well-established local band his services in December of 1961, and changed everything. As manager, it was Brian who civilized the Beatles. He banned cursing, drinking, and fighting on stage. He dressed them in suits and asked them to bow. From there, he set his sights on growing the band. Within months, he got them working with George Martin, a fifth Beatle in his own right, and signed to their first record label, EMI. The next 5 years were spent steering a supersonic freight train with no brakes. Brian was the steady hand guiding the group through Beatlemania, with his keen instincts protecting the band from the turbulence of the industry, and oftentimes, themselves. Even as the Beatles made the unprecedented choice to stop performing live in the summer of 1966, Brian was there. His role within the band shifting and changing to meet each new challenge. Until August 27th, 1967, when he died. The Beatles were in the early stages of their widely publicized spiritual awakening when they found out. Thus, when time came to give some sort of public comment about Brian's passing, John tried to put it in those terms, simply commenting that Brian is just passing into the next phase, while his comments in later years would point towards a different attitude. I knew that we were in trouble then. I didn't really have any misconceptions about our ability to do anything other than play music. I was scared. I thought, we fucking had it. Without Epstein, the Beatles were rudderless. Though he was by no means the band's ruthless dictator or even the genius pulling their strings, he was an expert mediator, a leader in spirit. Without him, who would lead the Beatles? Well, Paul McCartney was no slouch. What made the Beatles special was that everyone pulled their weight, everyone had a role to play, and Paul's was as one half of Lennon-McCartney. The duo is credited with writing about 165 Beatles songs, or just under 80% of the band's discography. So as you'd expect, these two had a very special relationship. They were best friends, but they were also very different. John was the rebel, Paul was the sweetheart. John pissed off the press, Paul smoothed things over. Rock and pop, sugar and spice, you get it. But John was also the oldest founding member of the group, and the most founding of the founding members. He started their predecessor, the Quarrymen, without the rest, and thought of the new name as they piled in. And so for those first few years, in most matters, John was seen as the head Beatle. But that same ambition that put him ahead of his friends also made him ahead of the curve. Even as early as 1967, John was already getting pretty bored of the whole Beatle thing. He was still involved enough to help guide the band away from mop tops, but his focus was being drawn towards other matters. When it came time for someone within the group to step up and take the Beatles in a new direction, the responsibility would not fall on Lennon, but McCartney. Now this might contradict the brief summary of his character that I gave earlier, but don't get it twisted. In this instance, sweet did not mean submissive. Unlike George, who was often dismissed for being too young, and Ringo, who was a hell of a drummer. Paul always knew how to get his way and never let himself fade into the background. So when the band were first feeling aimless after the disastrous Summer '66 tour, Paul pitched the idea of a concept album. One of the first, where the Beatles would play the role of fictional musicians, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, a massive success for the group that really shifted the public's perception of them as more serious musicians. That idea got them through the massive blow to morale that was Brian Epstein's death, and so after that, the Beatles followed Paul on an even crazier journey. One that would coincidentally help fill the need for a contractually obligated third Beatle film. 1967's The Magical Mystery Tour would not only become a cult classic for avant-garde movie fans, but another mainstream hit in its soundtrack, helping push the Beatles in a more psychedelic and experimental direction as they continued to explore beyond what could be replicated on stage. These projects not only instilled Paul with confidence that he could lead the band in music, but in business too. Just before he died, Brian Epstein had renegotiated the Beatles' contract with EMI and started bringing in a lot more money, orders of magnitude more. So he established Beatles & Company to manage and distribute it. Paul saw this company as an opportunity to expand the band into something more, choosing a new name, Apple Corps, and going full multimedia. Not just Apple Records, but Apple Films, Apple Electronics, Apple Publishing, even Apple Retail. Just about everything and anything that might interest the band in one neat little pile. Depending on your definition of neat. Taking everything I've said at face value, you might be wondering why the Beatles ever broke up in the first place. It would seem the band was the gift that kept on giving, with Paul at the helm guiding them towards higher and higher peaks. But nothing's ever as good as it seems. And all good things must pass. The next great idea McCartney had for the direction of the band was a return to the live format. A bit of a left turn. The Beatles' last tour was bad enough to discourage anyone from stepping on stage again, and some of the music that they were producing lately would be impossible to play live without the GDP of a small country. Paul persisted, however, and convinced the band to film a few test performances in the months before the release of their self-titled White Album, which went well enough to convince them to go along with Paul's strangest plot yet. A fourth Beatles movie, distributed by Apple, filmed on a soundstage, showing the Beatles writing, recording, and ultimately performing a brand new album. Also, they had less than 3 weeks to do it because Ringo was shooting a movie. It did not go as planned. To understand why, we'll have to look away from our golden boy for a second, starting with John. You see, John was still bored. The same boredom that left him indifferent on the subject of leading the Beatles a year and a half prior drove him towards other creative endeavors, and eventually into the arms of one Yoko Ono. Let's not pretend she needs an introduction. Though the rumors that she single-handedly coordinated the destruction of the Beatles from a secret government facility in Omaha are untrue, she did not help. Ono showed John a big, beautiful world outside of the band, did a bunch of scary drugs with him, and overall just encouraged his least productive habits. John often didn't show up for the Let It Be sessions. When he did, he was usually late, and when he sat down, Yoko sat right down next to him. Paul would fluctuate in how often he spoke about Ono's influence publicly, but in more moderate times, he still went as far as to complain that, with Yoko watching, I always felt that I had to come out with something clever and avant-garde. Surprisingly, George was a lot more open with his disdain for Yoko in the studio, though that might be a little unfair, as around this time he was just getting a lot more open, period. For much of the band's history, he was content to go with whatever John and Paul wanted, whether it be a world tour or no more touring ever, one song of his on the new record or none at all. That all changed when the band went to India together in 1968. George's eyes opened wider than anyone else on that trip, and he came back with a much better sense of himself. He began to fight harder for what he wanted in the studio, pitching his best material yet for the White Album, while still facing the same responses he got as a literal teenager. This extended into the recording of Let It Be, when after weeks of saying he didn't want to play live and didn't like the cameras on him, George was pushed too far. The record didn't have a producer, but Paul was really starting to take that leader position seriously. Creative pointers turned to nitpicks, and after a few days of McCartney leaning over his shoulder, Harrison had had enough. He quit the Beatles. It was not an unprecedented decision. Just a few months prior, Ringo Starr, of all people, left the band. In more recent interviews, he'd say that it was because he felt unappreciated by the other members, but historians believe it was more likely a rise in conflict during the White Album that got to him. He was convinced to return and the album was finished, but that infighting only got worse. Getting George to come back would be a harder task, one that involved scrapping Paul's plan for a big Beatles concert and moving the band's recording away from that, let's be honest, awful-looking film studio. From there, work continued on the new album with very little difficulty. Spirits were even raised enough to convince the band to end the new movie with a big climax. On the afternoon of January 29, 1969, the band ascended the stairs of their own corporate headquarters, set up their equipment, and performed an impromptu concert to anyone in earshot. The Beatles' rooftop performance would go down as one of the most iconic shows in music history, and the band seemed closer than ever. None of them knew that just yesterday, the seeds were sowed for their downfall. John Lennon and Yoko Ono had met with Alan Klein for the first time. He was charming, down-to-earth, and well-connected. He had famously represented the Rolling Stones for years and managed their own meteoric rise. Now, he was offering his services to the Beatles. This was not a chance meeting, however. Just as the Beatles were privately falling apart behind the scenes, Apple Corps was doing so much more publicly. Turns out John's prediction was right. The Beatles were great musicians, but they didn't know anything about business. Even as Epstein's new contract with EMI was bringing in mountains of cash, they were managing to blow it just as quickly. Apple Electronics was headed by Magic Alex, a Greek inventor and friend of John's whose only real talent was making money disappear. And Apple Retail became such a headache that one day the band agreed to give away everything inside their store for free just to close up shop sooner. This obviously drew a lot of media attention, and John was happy to give quotes about how much of a mess they had made financially. Klein read the news and saw blood in the water. He approached John, flattered Yoko, and promised to fix all their problems with a wave of his hand. And as Alex proved, Lennon was quick to believe the word of magicians. That same day, John signed Alan as his personal manager and began pushing for the Beatles to sign him as well. But McCartney had issues with this. A bit of digging revealed some shady business dealings in Klein's past, and he had already begun speaking to another candidate. Paul thought Lee Eastman was the obvious choice. The rest of the gang, not so much. Eastman was a much more traditional and stuck-up lawyer type than the sideburns sporting Klein, and moreover, he was literally the father of McCartney's girlfriend. It didn't help that Paul was becoming a less likable character by the day. Not only had he begun playing producer in the studio, he was the brains behind the Apple idea. This whole mess could arguably be put on his shoulders more than anyone, with Klein hitting the final nail into his coffin. There was a plan to save Apple Corps' financials in two crafty business moves: the purchase of Brian Epstein's old company NEMS and Northern Songs. These two groups took a substantial portion of the Beatles' royalty money, so if they could be owned by the Beatles, that would be huge. But these companies were still being sought after by other investors, so buying them outright was a lengthy process that had to be handled delicately. At this stage, no one had been signed to represent the band yet, but both Alan Klein and Lee Eastman were working to get the Beatles these companies. It was during the scramble that Klein discovered something big. The Beatles' shares in Northern Songs were owned by Paul and John as individuals, and they went into it 50-50. Like the Lennon-McCartney writing partnership, even if one song was written almost entirely by just one of them, it would always be credited to the both of them. That's how it was meant to be in business as well. Lennon and McCartney as equal partners. But on the advice of Lee Eastman, Paul had bought slightly more shares in Northern Songs than John, meaning that John could not work with Alan Klein to help secure a buyout of the company by putting the Beatles' shares up as collateral. He was powerless, because for the first time, from the band's perspective, Paul had made a move to control the Beatles without the other Beatles. The next day, John, George, and Ringo sent a letter to Lee Eastman. The message was simple. The Beatles had no more use for his services. 3 weeks later, on May 9, 1969, the band officially signed Alan Klein to manage their company. Paul fought it, but they didn't technically need his signature. And right now, they didn't really want it either. This was the biggest crack that had ever formed in the shell of the Beatles. But despite that, behind the scenes, they were working on another album. Don't ask me why. Even the interviews and biographies get vague when the subject comes up. It's just something we'll never quite understand. That even throughout the many ups and downs of their decade writing and performing together, the Beatles always found a way to get the songs done. But as the months passed and the plans to purchase NEMS and Northern Songs slowly crumbled, reality started creeping back in. On August 25th, the Beatles had finished Abbey Road, and by September, John Lennon had decided to quit the band. The only real pushback he found was from Alan Klein, who didn't want the hit to his bank account, and Paul McCartney. You might think by now that Paul was nothing more than a control freak, that he broke up the Beatles because he wanted the music done his way and the business in his hands. But try and dig a little deeper. Do you really think that Paul's motivation behind these choices were as simple as ego and money? If so, why would he go back on so many of his controversial decisions? Why would he apologize to George Harrison for overstepping during the Let It Be sessions and begin allowing for more of his songs on the record? Why would he ultimately follow the band into working with Alan Klein? Why not just quit the Beatles and hire a group of young artists he could boss around as much as he wanted? Why was he the only guy that never quit the band? Because it wasn't control that he was after. Paul's end goal was not to mold the Beatles into his vision, it was to save the Beatles by any means necessary. Brian Epstein was the glue that kept these guys together through thick and thin. With him gone, what was there to keep these growing young artists together, each one massively talented and capable on their own? Paul saw to it that there was never any need to raise that question. There was always another project they could do together, each one more bizarre and challenging than the last. They would play make-believe, direct a movie, write and record a brand new album live on camera. But the more he pushed to keep the band all together, the more they grew to resent him. None of them wanted to be pushed to do anything anymore. So despite his best efforts, John left the Beatles. The rest of the band followed him. And Paul was left alone. In the end, a lot of things broke up the Beatles. Mostly business and time. But the end of the band's career was not the end of Paul's. He was working on something behind the scenes. Nobody knew it at the time, but a new story was just beginning. And there was more for McCartney after the Beatles. Thank you for watching this on Nebula.